kind of interesting. Small tells you what's the nth smallest number. So what's the number one smallest, the second smallest, etc. Standard deviation is kind of interesting. So let's talk about this. So you all know about bell curves. So if you think about data, any data set ever follows a standard distribution. Now, if it's a good data set, some data sets can be skewed and so forth, but that gets kind of complicated. So we'll assume you have a data set that has an even distribution. And if you have a very large amount of data, usually the data has a standard distribution. Remember when we talked about mean and median? So median can be very powerful in eliminating outliers, but one reason that mean is very important is you can't create a standard distribution with a median. Statistically, for reasons that are kind of complicated, but that can be proven, which is called the central theorem, distributions have a center based upon a mean and then have a distribution. So 66% of the data lies within one standard deviation in either direction. 95% of the data lies within two standard deviations. This is why when before I said that for that R squared test, anything below 90 or 95% is not a good piece of data. That's because it suggests that that data lies outside of the very edges of this data. So it's not a very good representation of a trend. If you think about this standard deviation, if this is the mean, then the standard deviation tells you how far out this curve bulges out. So, if you want to know what the bell curve is for a piece of data, you could take the mean. So I could take the average or the average of this. Then I could take the standard deviation, just STDEV of the same range. And now, one standard deviation outside the data is, in one direction, it's 8, and in the other direction, it's 61. So anything that's more than one standard deviation outside isn't a great fit, but you could keep it in the data if you wanted to. Anything that's more than 2 standard deviations outside, though, you definitely should throw out. So in this case, for example, I would consider 100 to be a significant outlier as well as 90, because 2 standard deviations above the average is 88, and both of these values are above that value. So I would consider these to be outliers that are not indicative of the group's performance. Does that make sense? Any questions on that?